U.S. Assistant Secretary of State for African Affairs, Johnny Carson, has provoked a diplomatic row with Nairobi over his remarks on the upcoming Kenyan election. Now, outraged Nairobi has sought a clarification on the diplomat's statement, which it seems to interpret as contradicting an earlier message by U.S. President Barack Obama to Kenyans on the March 4th election. Now, the European Union has also been sucked into the row. So what exactly did President Obama say, and what did he mean? And is it possible that Johnny Carson could be contradicting his boss by making statements that are not sanctioned by the U.S. State Department? Well, joining us in this discussion is Ambassador Boaz Mbaya. He is a career diplomat who has served in several Kenyan missions abroad. Also joining us on the program is Mr. Ndungu Wainaina, the Executive Director for the International Center for Policy and Conflict, and Mr. Moses Kuria, a political strategist, also here in Nairobi. But first, let's take a look at how Kenya's presidential race is shaping up.
Wanted by the International Criminal Court for Crimes Against Humanity and now running for president, Uhuru Muigai Kenyatta appears to be an isolated man. Last week, European ambassadors had stated that they would only have limited contacts with Kenyatta if he wins the March 4th general election.
The remarks by EU envoys are clearly inflammatory and could have the effect of polarizing the country.
And this has clearly infuriated the Kenyan government, with Foreign Affairs Minister Sam Ongeri, a close ally of Kenyatta, now fighting back, accusing the envoys of interfering with Kenya's internal affairs.
Indeed, these elections are heavily contested, and statements warning Kenyans that the poll results, even in favor of certain candidates, will have consequences could amount to taking sides and even allegations of advanced rigging.
We're all here as envoys. Our mandate is to favor conducive, good, fruitful relations for a prosperous Kenya. And that must be absolutely clear. The last thing we want is to interfere in the internal affairs.
Uhuru Kenyatta and his running mate William Ruto are due to stand trial at the ICC in April for their alleged role in the deadly post-election violence 5 years ago that claimed the lives of more than 1,000 Kenyans. U.S. Assistant Secretary of State for African Affairs Johnny Carson has also issued similar threats, saying, quote, choices have consequences. China, on the other hand, is taking a laid-back approach.
With the joint efforts by the Kenyan government and the Kenyan people, this year's election will be held peacefully and successfully. We are looking forward to strengthening cooperation with the new Kenyan government.
Uhuru Kenyatta is among 8 candidates vying for Kenya's top job in what is arguably the biggest and most competitive election. Jane Carroll, CCTV.
So indeed, what was not said this week in Nairobi? First, I'll start off with you, Moses. Now, the U.S. President had initially said the choice of who will lead Kenya is up to the Kenyan people. The United States does not endorse any candidate for office. The European Union later on made their own statement. Johnny Carson has made another statement. What exactly was said? What is your understanding of what was said?
I think the beginning point is first, before even we go to the content of what Obama said, is to ask the question, is it ordinary for a president to come out and speak to a country? Because that's the beginning point. In normal circumstances, that's an extraordinary situation. It's not possible. And therefore, there must have been a reason why the president chose first to speak himself. And therefore, there was absolutely no contradiction between what he said and what later on was said by the African Director of Foreign Affairs.
Let me come back first to what you said. It is an extraordinary situation for a president to speak to another country. What is at stake here for the U.S.?
I think the first thing is the president must have been well informed about the situation on the ground, on their own assessment, what the situation is on the ground. And I can tell you with certainty that they must have been on the ground. They are on the ground. They do a lot of correction of information. They have engaged with Kenyan authorities. And they must have reached a conclusion where it was the president first to take the take on the stage and make a message, and therefore it's upon the Foreign Affairs Department, therefore, to proceed with the diplomatic engagement from there.
Moses, was there a contradiction?
I think there was massive contradiction because, first of all, if the president did make that statement, then why does it need any explanation or any interpretation, or any reiteration, So, to the extent that Ambassador Carlson's statement was superfluous, then it was contradictory, because in the first place it was unnecessary, because Obama's statement was, first of all, recorded. Second thing, it was in print. It was clear. So there was, unless they were assuming that Kenyans have a problem understanding English language, they don't understand.
In your understanding, though, what is it that you think Johnny Carson was trying to put across that his boss didn't put across?
You know what happened? That statement was received very well by Kenyan people. I mean, Obama's statement, and. Of course, some people must have been busy, making all sorts of phone calls. Now, what are you doing to us? Just when we think we are on the right course in this, that statement by President Obama is not very helpful. And therefore, culmination of that was, oops, how can we make damage control? We seem to have, disappointed some people who, we don't think it's good to disappoint. And therefore, since the president cannot, make, a follow-up statement on his own statement, why don't we ask Mr. Carson to make the statement?
Is that your understanding?
Let me say this. Before even I go to what Carson said, from what I said, extraordinary, thing for the president to do what he did, there are 3 operative phrases in Obama's statement that ought to give you an indicator of why he chose to come out and speak. One is that he used the word, don't go to the street, go to the court. That's one. 2, he used the word rule of law. You must adhere to the rule of law. And then finally, he talked about democratic country which must be able to conduct free and fair elections. And when you look at what I said, extraordinary circumstances, and you look at now the content of certain operative words in his statement, then you're able to see that there was absolutely no contradiction. Now, if you are now to take that and you go to what John Carson said, and you read the whole text of John Carson, then you see absolutely nothing contradictory at all.
Moses.
Well, first of all, I agree with my brother here about the operative statement, because Obama was very clear, and that is very consistent with what some of us have been saying about the rule of law, due process, no violence, respect the outcome of the election, conduct free and fair. Those are our buzzwords. It's an honor that all of us do agree that the way to resolve, electoral disputes is through the court system, the rule of law, through, and we all agree that, the question of free and fair election is not disputable. So that is consistent with not only what Obama said, Carson said the same thing. So in that respect, there's no contradiction, and what all of us are saying. Now, the mischief was in, and there's going to be consequences. Clearly, there's a consequence to everything. Electing Obama or Romney had consequences, isn't it? Yeah, there was consequences on who you elect. Whether you voted for Obama or Romney, there were consequences. So it can't be that it was a general statement. It must have been calculated to water down the statement of Obama, actually to make it nugatory.
All right, let me just get your understanding there, Ambassador Mbaya, on this whole situation. Was there a contradiction from Washington on what was said by U.S. Barack Obama on the Kenyan election, and thereafter clarified, so to speak, by Johnny Carson?
Let us put things into perspective. The first point I would like to make is that there is no contradiction in the first place. The chief foreign policy spokesman of any country is the chief executive officer of the country, who is, in this case, the president. And what is said would normally be generally said in general terms. And what Ambassador Carson came to clarify was what sort of action they were going to take if indeed certain results are pronounced at the end of the electoral period, which is March 5th. Now, in this case, it is not necessarily extraordinary that the president took the chance to speak about Kenya. It is unusual. It's not normally done. But I think President Obama occupies a special place in our history. His own father is Kenyan, was Kenyan. And I think he takes greater interest in what happens in Kenya than most other presidents of the United States have done in the past. So we should not fault him. The problem, I think, as a result of that statement is how our own people reacted to it. We started more or less just thumping ourselves that nothing is going to happen, no sanctions will be imposed. Nobody talked about sanctions in Obama's statement. So I think we jumped to the gun in many ways.
All right. I just want to get your understanding here, because also Kenya's former foreign minister, Moses Wetangula, did weigh in on the matter, and he said Kenya does not live in isolation. He said our bilateral and multilateral friends, our trading partners, the international community have every right to not only show concern on our issues, but to talk about them. Do you agree?
You see, the most important thing that I think Kenyans must ask themselves is the bigger consequence outside there or internally, because that's for me is a fundamental question in whatever decisions we make. Is the implication larger out there or internally first? Because if we sort out that question, then it will help us to clarify many of things to us. And let me give you an example. It is when you look at some of the choices Kenyans are offering out there to make decisions on are actually in contradiction of their own legal norms. Because that for me helps ourselves to begin internally before even we talk about outside. I can tell you this, there is no single international country, whether America, Europe or other, are going to impose sanctions, blanket sanctions to a country like Kenya. No, but I can assure you that to the specific individuals it has effects. But the larger effect is on our own legal norms that we have, our own institutions. So the issue here of consequences and the choice you make has a bigger impact on the country itself internally more than even outside, basically.
That whole question of consequences, Moses, how do you read that?
There's going to be good consequences. I am from Jubilee, and I do believe that there's going to be good consequences for electing a Jubilee government. Those are the only consequences I know. You've got to remember, and I keep saying this, to every media house, that the West, specifically Europe, has got absolutely no capacity to impose sanctions on anyone. Their economies are either growing at zero or they are in recession. They have got more problems than us. They need us in every other respect. They need us for geostrategic reasons. They need us for trade. They need us to protect their shipping waters because of the Somali problem and all that. So yes, we are not living in isolation. Why? Because when there are problems with the pirates in Somalia, it is us who are asked to use our own courts, which are discredited, to try the pirates. And therefore, there are going to be consequences for them.
This whole idea of consequences, though, what do you see as the impact?
First,
Moses there says the European Union, in terms of the European Union, there might be none.
Let me make this, and I'll make it very blunt. I want my colleague here to explain to the world how, for instance, a presidency of one Uhuru Kenyatta will reconcile with this constitution, particularly under Article 132, which specifically talks about the president shall ensure that our international obligations are met. That's one. Two, under Article 143, the Constitution specifically says the president has no immunity for any international crimes that he or she is facing, as long as those crimes do not enjoy immunity. How is that simply going to be reconciled? This is a very simple thing. It's our legal instrument that we have. So who is going to give way? Is it the presidency of Uhuru Kenyatta, or is it the Constitution?
Moses.
Let me answer the part of the Constitution first and how he's going to uphold it. The president is going to be elected under this Constitution itself. He's not going to be, to be elected under a novel by James Hadley Chase. The very election of the president is under the Constitution. So he's going to be under the Constitution.
No, just a minute,
Wait. Yes. The president is going to implement from the first chapter to the last chapter of the Constitution. He has got a small matter, at a certain court called the International Criminal Court, just like many other people have got matters elsewhere. Now he has said very consistently that he's going to cooperate with the court.
All right, Ndungu, you had a comment.
I'm asking a specific question, because you see me, I'm very practical. And one thing I'm trying to say is this: an Uhuru presidency is subjecting the Constitution of Kenya on a referendum. Because if this Constitution is going to survive and Uhuru presidency, then one thing I can tell the world and Kenyans at large is that this constitution has to be done a thorough amendment. So the question is, are we moving forward as a country, having fought for more than 30 years to get a progressive constitution? Is that what we want to build Africa on?
All right, I want to get Ambassador Mbaya's comment on this. The gentlemen here have talked about the consequences that could face Kenya in the event that there is a Uhuru Kenyatta presidency. What's your take on that?
Let us begin from 2007, 2008. International public attention has been focused on Kenya like never before. And therefore, what we are doing now is seen throughout the world as an example of how young democracy should begin to develop, and also how countries should address their problems internally. In this particular case, we are dealing with the two publics. The first is international public. The second is domestic public. But within the domestic public, you have several publics also, which are attached to, say, in the current presidential campaign, different candidates. So when you sum up the domestic publics into one, you are therefore facing a conflict between, or a relationship between domestic public and international public. International public today is against impunity. That's why President Obama would say what he said. That's why Carson said what he said. And that's why Kenya has to be very careful what it does in terms of electing its leaders. It is true when Obama campaigned with Mitt Romney, there were consequences on either side. Whoever got elected meant certain things were going to happen in a different way. And therefore, Kenya cannot live in isolation. I think we must be absolutely careful.
All right, gentlemen, we'll return to this discussion in a moment. For now, we'll take a short break. Now, by warning of a possible backlash if certain candidates win the Kenyan presidential election, can the US and the EU still claim they are for a free and fair election and that Kenyans are free to vote for candidates of their choice? And what are the implications for the elections regarding the timing of the comments? And what might be lying in store for Kenya should these candidates win the March 4th elections? Well, still with us here on the program is Ambassador Boaz Mbaya, a career diplomat, joining us here in Nairobi. And in studio with me, Ndungu Wainaina, the Executive Director, International Center for Policy and Conflict, and Moses Kuria, a political strategy. Now, Ndungu, let me start here with you. The European Union, the United States have made their statements, but have also said that they are still neutral in this whole scenario. Are they, though?
The most important thing here is to ask the question of level of engagement. I think when you look at how even the entire electoral system in Kenya is actually supported, European Union is the single biggest contributor in terms of supporting the electoral process in this country. They support the Independent Electoral and Boundaries Commission, they support the civic education program and all that. You look at the UNDP, they are the single biggest in terms of basket and all that. So even before you raise questions about their neutrality, the question would be, we have not even been able to finance our own elections. That's the point. But we are saying they cannot use that as hard maiden to drive us, but also in terms of our own accountability. I think for me, the largest test is on Africa. Do we have sustainable institutions that are able to drive our own countries? If you look at the Constitutive Act of the African Union itself, it's very clear, in express terms, rejects impunity. Nobody wants it. It has consequences to our own people in Africa. For how long are we Africans going to suffer because of our own internal failures? All
right, I'll ask that question to Moses. Can they still claim neutrality in the Kenyan election?
No, not at all. Because in an election as tense and as tight as the one we are just about to have in less than 3 weeks, they ought to have been more careful with their statements, unless their intention, of course, is to plunge Kenya into chaos. I'm glad that a certain civil society activist went to court to block the Americans, the EU, and the UK specifically from being accredited as observers in this election. And I think that is as it should be, because you cannot claim that you can be a neutral observer where you have openly taken sides in this. And let us even lift the veil here and look at what is really the import of what they have been saying. What they have been saying is that we would want a particular candidate to be elected, but since that cannot happen through the ballot, we are going to use every diplomatic means available to block that.
All right, Ambassador Mbaya, do you see double standards here from the United States, from the European Union? Can they still claim neutrality in the Kenyan election?
You know, it is very strange that we become too sensitive about comments from outside. We have ourselves to blame, I think, in this particular case. What the West is trying to do is pointing out that there are problems we need to address. They came to our assistance in 2008. Nobody complained at that time. Why are we complaining now? Is it because we are on the receiving end? I would like to put it this way, that there is every chance outsiders are going to comment about our elections. And I don't think it should necessarily send us spinning because outsiders are commenting. They are entitled to comment on the elections, and they are also entitled to make their views known. What we need to do as Kenyans is to act. They don't have a vote here. We have the vote to put in our leaders. You have not said you cannot elect Mheshimiwa Kenyatta or Ruto. They have said if they are elected, then the relationship will be reevaluated. And that is a perfectly normal thing to do in any international situation.
Now, I just want to put this to you, Moses, that in the event that Uhuru Kenyatta is elected president, and with all this talk of essential contact and consequences, what kind of foreign policy is Kenya likely to have? What will be Kenya's relationship with the West?
Well, our relationship with everyone, not the West, is very clearly stipulated in our manifesto, which we released over a week ago. And in that manifesto, we are very clear that the future, ICC or no ICC, sanctions or no sanctions, the West or not the West, the cornerstone of the Jubilee policy on foreign relations is based on trade. That we are going to have a pecking order of friendship based on our economic interests. Yeah? Who is buying our goods, who is buying our coffee, who is buying our tea is on the top of that list. That does not need to be a particular country or the other. We want to work with everyone. We are going to work with everyone. Yeah? We are going to engage all these countries based on what I would call a partnership of the willing. So there has to be two parties here. If they don't want, that's their own shouting.
All right. Ndungu.
You know,
what kind of foreign policy are we likely to see?
Let's be realistic here, because sometimes we take some things for granted. Let me tell you this. The High Court of the Republic of Kenya issued a warrant of arrest against one al-Bashir. That warrant issued by a court of Kenya. Suppose today Uhuru Kenyatta is elected the president and chooses not to engage with the ICC. A Kenyan goes to court and seeks his indictment. What will happen to that? So when you talk about consequences, you need to see how Bashir operates, and then you start to think how Kenya is going to operate. Let me give you an example.
All right.
We have Mera farmers in Meru who are struggling to get market. Who can negotiate for this? It's your president or your vice president.
All right, let's hear that from Moses.
Now let us really not underestimate the need and the hunger for the West, for markets and for resources. Right now, as we speak, there is more new oil being found in Africa than anywhere else in the world. These guys have benefited from our resources. You look at the case of Magadi Soda, trillions and trillions of shillings are shipped in raw form for very little benefit for our country. You know what? A Jubilee government will check that.
All right. Ambassador Mbai, I want to get your thoughts on this before we wind up on the program. In the event that Uhuru Kenyatta becomes the president of Kenya, what is the foreign policy that we are likely to see?
It's very difficult to envisage because you are dealing with a country that will be isolated. You're dealing with leadership that will be isolated. You're dealing with being considered more or less like a pariah state. We don't want to go that route. I think it will be very difficult to conduct a meaningful foreign policy for the country if your leaders are themselves subject to international scrutiny.
All right, Moses.
The issue of America commenting on ICC when it's not even a member, how can you have consequences based on something you don't belong to? They don't belong to the ICC. They're not members of the ICC. So how can there be consequences? How will they even know? They will not get even a dispatch of what happens at the ICC. It's part of their personal friendship with some people that we have here and who are participants in this election.
The U.S. is not a member of the Rome Statute. Why should they comment on issues such as this?
I think that United States is one of the biggest contributors to the Rome Statute. Kenya, as a country which is state part of to the Rome Statute, is actually a big contributor to the same court. So it self-defeats Moses here when he claims that the ICC is bankrupt. Then the question is, has Kenya met its obligation? Just another day, the Kenya shilling was collapsing. Kenya government was forced to go and negotiate with the IMF to get a loan, about I think 350 million US dollars to stabilize the shilling. Now, this is where the issue comes to matter most. The person who sanctions that is the president. It cannot be anybody else in terms of national currency, stabilizing our economy. And Kenyans knew the consequences when the shilling fluctuated, what it meant.
All right, as we are winding up, Moses.
Even if you look at the Western economic interests, you look at the banking system, you look at this country in terms of that foreign currency, the big banks here, we have got Standard Chartered Bank, we've got Barclays Bank, you look at the Americans, we've got Citibank here, so their interests are very deep in this country, and I will look forward to the day that Barclays Bank says from tomorrow we are closing doors, we are not opening because Uhuru Kenyatta is president. I really look forward. So I think it's naive, sorry for the language, to assume that the West is going to do things that are going to hurt its own economic interest. And further, you have to remember that Kenya is not Kenya only. We have got Kenya as a regional hub. If you look at Barclays Bank, they have got their regional operations here. If you look at East African Breweries, which is really Diageo, which is a British company, we have got their regional office here. At the end of the day, it's going to come to Kenya's competitiveness. And the fact that we attract certain things in terms of investment, in terms of, it's not just an act of charity. It's because we have got some core competencies that put us in a pole position that will keep Americans and British and all the other people coming, but competing on a fair level with the Chinese and the Indians.
All right, Ambassador Mbaya, your winding up comments.
I want to say that foreign policy is derived from the Constitution itself. And if we have adopted all international treaties we have signed, as part of our local laws here. Therefore, it will be a vote of no confidence actually voting people who will not be able to implement the Constitution, people who will have integrity issues internationally as well as domestically. And Kenyans must therefore take the decision when they are voting from a very informed position indeed. I hope we'll make the right decision at the end of the day.
All right, Ndungu Wainaina, the Executive Director, International Center for Policy and Conflict, and Moses Kuria, Political Strategist here in Nairobi, and Ambassador Boaz Mbaya, career diplomat. Gentlemen, thank you very much for joining us here on Talk Africa. I'm Beatrice Marshall in Nairobi. Bye-bye.
Jane Kale, CCTV.
So indeed, what was not said this week in Nairobi. First, I'll start off with you, Moses. Now, the U.S. President had initially said the choice of who will lead Kenya is up to the Kenyan people. The United States does not endorse any candidate for office. The European Union later on made their own statement. Johnny Carson has made another statement. What exactly was said? What is your understanding of what was said?
I think the beginning point is first, before even we go to the content of what Obama said, is to ask the question, is it ordinary for a president to come out and speak to a country? Because that's the beginning point. In normal circumstances, that's an extraordinary situation. It's not possible. And therefore, there must have been a...
Boaz Mbaya, he is a career diplomat who has served in several Kenyan missions abroad. Also joining us on the program is Mr. Ndungu Wainaina, the Executive Director for the International Center for Policy and Conflict. And Mr. Moses Kuria, a political strategist, also here in Nairobi. But first, let's take a look at how Kenya's presidential race is shaping up.
Wanted by the International Criminal Court for crimes against humanity and now running for president, Uhuru Muigai Kenyatta appears to be an isolated man. Last week, European ambassadors had stated that they would only have limited contacts with Kenyatta if he wins the March 4th general election.
The remarks by EU envoys are clearly inflammatory and could have the effect of polarizing the country.
And this has clearly infuriated the Kenyan government with
U.S. Assistant Secretary of State for African Affairs, Johnny Carson, has provoked a diplomatic row with Nairobi over his remarks on the upcoming Kenyan election. Now, outraged Nairobi has sought a clarification on the diplomat's statement, which it seems to interpret as contradicting an earlier message by U.S. President Barack Obama to Kenyans on the March 4th election. Now, the European Union has also been sucked into the row. So what exactly did President Obama say, and what did he mean? And is it possible that Johnny Carson could be contradicting his boss by making statements that are not sanctioned by the U.S. State Department? Well, joining us in this discussion is Ambassador.
Alleged role in the deadly post-election violence 5 years ago that claimed the lives of more than 1,000 Kenyans. U.S. Assistant Secretary of State for African Affairs Johnny Carson has also issued similar threats, saying, quote, choices have consequences. China, on the other hand, is taking a laid-back approach.
With the joint efforts by the Kenyan government and the Kenyan people, this year's election will be held peacefully and successfully. We are looking forward to strengthening cooperation with the new Kenyan government.
Uhuru Kenyatta is among 8 candidates vying for Kenya's top job in what is arguably the biggest and most competitive election. Foreign Affairs Minister Sam Ongeri, a close ally of Kenyatta, now fighting back, accusing the envoys of interfering with Kenya's internal affairs.
Indeed, these elections are heavily contested, and statements warning Kenyans that the poll results, even in favor of certain candidates, will have consequences could amount to taking sides and even allegations of advanced rigging.
We're all here as envoys. Our mandate is to favor conducive, good, fruitful relations for a prosperous Kenya. And that must be absolutely clear. The last thing we want is to interfere in the internal affairs.
Uhuru Kenyatta and his running mate William Ruto are due to stand trial at the ICC in April for their